mentioned in the bio, which is an organization called the IDSF, Israel Defense and Security Forum, of which I'm also a member, which is a grassroots organization of more than 20,000 former or veterans of Israeli security organizations, IDF, police, Mossad, Shabak, prison services, who focus on a few things internally in Israel: education, policy, and security. The main goal is to ensure the enduring success and prosperity of this beautiful endeavor that we are now in, the Zionist endeavor, and the country that we have and that we so much love. Speaking on behalf of that organization, of course, as introduced, I'm a senior fellow at the FDD, Foundation for Defense of Democracies. For those who don't know, it is a DC think tank focusing on US foreign policy, and their mission statement is to inflict as much damage as possible to the enemies of democracy. So Russia, China, Iran, terrorist organizations, and of course any enemy of Israel. So I'm very happy to work there with excellent people. You may be familiar with Mark Dubovitz or Jonathan Schanzer, Cliff May, the founder. These are the main people there, but lots of experts there, and I newly joined. What we will be speaking about once we get or we will start speaking, but we'll have a map up behind me as well, after we get the tech guy here, is a little bit about the situation. I think we'll do about 20 minutes. I'll just introduce a few things and a few things that I think are relevant to think about and to focus our thoughts on, and then I'm sure that you have questions about the current situation. Back in the headlines with the unfortunate incident of the killing of 7 aid workers from the World Kitchen, WCK. Very bad incident, which now is being investigated in the IDF, trying to understand exactly, or I think they've already understood what exactly led to that horrible result, a not intended and unintended result, and most importantly, how can it be prevented in the future, and how can we make sure that this organization and other positively intended humanitarian organizations, and I phrase it that way for a purpose. There are many humanitarian organizations that are not in the business of caring for humans. They're in the business of supporting Hamas, or in the business of self-sustainment, but there are a few good humanitarian organizations who actually care for humans. The WCK is one of them, and that's why it's double or very tragic that this organization was hit and 7 of its members were sadly killed. So that's being investigated. I'm sure you'll have questions about it. We can discuss it. Before we dive deep into the situation in Gaza, Judea and Samaria, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Houthis in Yemen, Iranian proxies in Syria, and if you want, if we must, we can talk Israeli politics as well, but before we do that, I want to zoom out for a second and look from 30,000, 40,000 feet and speak a little bit about the big picture, because so many times when we zoom in on how many internally displaced Palestinians are there in Rafah and how long will it take the IDF to evacuate them, we kind of lose sight of the big picture and what really is at play. I like to look at things from the perspective of my enemies. And when I look at things from an Iranian perspective, 2023 was probably the best year that the Iranian regime had in a generation. Like any autocratic dictatorship, the first priority of the Islamic State of Iran is to make sure that the regime is stable and that there are no threats to the regime. That's always priority number one. Any dictator, ask him, what's the number one concern, whether it's the Egyptian al-Sisi or the mullahs in Iran or other dictators. Shalom.
With the computer?
כן,
This one?
כן, תודה. אני אחבר גם את הסיפור נוסף גם.
כן, אז יש פה את ה-laptop, ופה, שם,
פה.
Can
Can I have can I trust you for the bag there, please? Yes. Now, thank you very much. Even though I am a man and I can only do one thing, I really tried to advance myself and to be able to do two things at once, but it doesn't work. If we go back to Iran. So, number one concern is the stability of the regime. Today, the Iranians can check that box. There are no longer threats to the regime. There are no protests on the streets. The brave men and women who took to the streets in Iran after Mahsa Amini was executed or killed by the police in Iran are no longer out on the streets. They've been silenced, jailed, or killed and intimidated, and they are no longer a threat to the regime. So check that box. The second issue is their long-term strategic goal of achieving nuclear military capabilities. And with this as well, I think the Iranians have done tremendous achievements. If you think of it, think back, since October the 7th, how many times have you heard any of the words related to nuclear weapons? How many times did you hear centrifuges, or enrichment, or uranium, or heavy water, or many other things? How many times did you hear that? My guess is that exactly none. Maybe if you're really die-hard news analysts, you heard it 2 weeks ago when the Atomic Agency issued a report in which they basically said, with a lot of fancy words, engineering words, they said, we don't know how much uranium the Iranians have, how much enriched uranium the Iranians have, and we don't really have visibility on their activities, but we assess that they have enough fissile material for 13 nuclear bombs. That's the Atomic Agency 2 weeks ago, acknowledging that they don't know, and saying that the little information we have, this is how bad the situation is. And the situation in Gaza, little Gaza and Lebanon, the situation there is really the distraction that the Iranians have, which serve the purposes of building their weapons of mass destruction. And things are working beautifully for them. And from an Iranian perspective, war in Gaza should go on. War with Hezbollah in Lebanon should go on. The longer it goes on, the more attention is focused on what they don't want, or focused on what they want, and it isn't focused, and the bandwidth isn't on the Iranian nuclear weapons and the collaboration between Iran and the Russians and many other horrible things that the Iranians are part of. תודה לך. לא צריך. תודה. That's the second thing. A third thing, which I think is quite remarkable, and I always respect my enemies. When I was a young platoon commander in Givati and then a company commander, I fought first in Lebanon against Hezbollah, then in Gaza against Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and a few other smaller terrorist organizations. And I always feared and respected my enemies. Whether or not my friends and colleagues and commanders did, I always looked at my enemies as if they are well-trained, very focused, disciplined, equipped, and constantly thinking of ways to outsmart us. I look at the Iranians with respect, but I think that we are overestimating the actual military capabilities of Iran to fight. Not their ability to employ, fund, and arm proxy organizations. They're in a league of their own. They're the best in the world when it comes to using proxies and sending others to do their work for them. But when it comes to fighting for Iran, I'm not sure how good they are. The last time that they fought was 7.5, 8 years of war against the Iraqi army in the 1980s, and they did not perform brilliantly by any stretch of the imagination. And in every instance when push has come to shove between Israel and the Iranians, I've seen Israel take action and the Iranians talk and threaten and not do a lot about it, but send their proxies forward. Why do I say that? Because what's going on in the Middle East now is Iran set the boundaries for basically the rules of engagement in the region, whereby Iranian proxies are attacking the US and Israel, and the US and Israel are retaliating against the Iranian proxies, not against Iran. The first time that now, since October the 7th, Iranian officers have been killed was 2 days ago in Damascus. A beautiful, well-timed, highly precision strike based on live intel and excellent operational capabilities in the heart of Damascus, in a place where the Iranians probably thought that they were safe, but they're not. And senior, important combatants, Iranian combatants, who are part of running operations against Israel, were eliminated and done so very well. That's the first time Israel has done it. Israel hasn't acknowledged it, but of course everybody knows that it's Israel. It wasn't the Swiss or the Swedes, and nobody else has neither the ability nor the interest to take out senior Iranian officials. But Iran continues to destabilize the Middle East. And I think that we're here now, beginning of 2014. You might as well plan your solidarity trip for 2029. Because if we don't address Iran differently, we will be in the same and perhaps worse situation in 5 years and 10 years. We will continue to have Iranian proxies around our country, whether it's Hamas now and some other iteration of Hamas afterwards, after we defeat Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iranian proxies in Syria. They are hard at work, the Iranians, at destabilizing Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, and they are hard at work at trying to dismantle infrastructure or to build terrorist infrastructure in Judea and Samaria, and to equip other terrorist organizations, Palestinian organizations, with standard weapons, standard explosives and weapons. Recently, last week, it was kind of lost in the news because a lot of things were happening, but last week the ISA, Israeli Shabak, and the IDF intercepted and thwarted a delivery of Iranian standard-grade weapons, anti-tank missiles, shoulder-fired missiles, RPG rockets, explosives, small arms, and ammunition, all of that smuggled from Iran, Iraq, through Jordan into Judea and Samaria, it was intended to different terrorist organizations in Judea and Samaria, intercepted by the IDF and by Shabak based on intel and other things. That's what's happening. So the bottom line here is, until we change our strategy with Iran, we shouldn't anticipate them to change theirs. Theirs is working. They are using proxies in order to advance their foreign policy, and it's working great. They're not paying a price for it. Sanctions are not working. They are not affecting the Iranian ability to get access to money. They have found ways to circumvent the sanction system. And today, Iran relies on exporting oil and petrochemical products and gas from this port here in Bandar Abbas and this port here in Bushehr. These are the two exit points. All of Iran's financial capabilities go through these two ports. And as long as they're open, and as long as they're functioning, and as long as Iranian oil and petrochemical products are offloaded there onto tankers and then travel to Russia, China, India, and other countries, and they have the ability to access financial systems in Qatar, the Emirates, and Oman, they'll continue to do what they're doing. We will continue to face jihadi violence, whether it's Sunni or Shiite, whether it's Palestinian, Syrian, Lebanese, Egyptian perhaps, I don't know. But the bottom line is, if we don't change our strategy, no reason for them to, because theirs is working. So that's the kind of like the introduction, from my point of view, to where we stand today, and what's in store for us from a strategic point of view. And now we can go into details a little bit about Gaza, then we'll speak about Judea and Samaria. So the situation in Gaza, I'm sorry that I'm blocking the view, but I have to stand somewhere. It's slow today. So So we're addressing the situation in Gaza. Currently, I don't know if you've read in Israeli media, but there are more Israeli troops in Judea and Samaria in preemptive deployment in order to stop attacks during Ramadan than we have soldiers deployed inside Gaza. So we're still fighting in Gaza. There's fighting in Gaza City, in Jabalia. There was quite a lot of activity here in the Shifa hospital just recently. For the second time, the Israeli troops went in and cleared it from terrorists, apprehended many terrorists, including senior ones, took a lot of weapons, ammunition, and money from the terrorist organizations who were again hiding in a hospital. Israeli troops are fighting in Khan Yunis, in southern Gaza, with good advances being made, but there's still a lot of work left to do. And of course, thank you very much. And of course, the last stand of Hamas in the southern part of Gaza is Rafah. Now, much has been spoken about Rafah. I'll give you the no-nonsense military assessment of what Hamas has and why Rafah is important. And then I'll explain why it's become such a hotly contested topic. Rafah is where the remaining intact battalions of Hamas are located. We're talking about 4 or 5 battalions. Hamas had 22 battalions when they launched their murderous attack on Israel on October the 7th. Today they have 4 or 5 battalions that are more or less intact, and they have stragglers and survivors and residue from other battalions that the IDF has dismantled to different levels. Some of them have been totally dismantled by the IDF, some are partially, there's more survivors, and most of those stragglers and leftovers of other battalions have probably made their way to Rafah as well. So we're talking about a few hundred, maybe a little bit more than, between 1,000 and 2,000 Hamas terrorists in armed formations. So it's not separate terrorists, but they're in fighting units with command and control, hierarchy, logistics, intel, and the ability to fight. We're talking about lots of civilians there. Civilians are there because that's where UNRWA and Hamas wanted them to go. We asked for them to go to humanitarian zone. We asked for the UN to build humanitarian zone in the early parts of the war. They decided not to because Hamas told them not to. Because Hamas wants the people, the civilians, above the important assets of Hamas in order to serve as human shields and in order to slow the advances of the IDF. UNRWA and the other organizations played along, and that is why we find ourselves in the situation that we are today. With the benefit of hindsight, Israel could definitely have addressed the issue in a different way. We could have taken the initiative, we could have taken, let's say, ownership of the humanitarian issue, built the humanitarian zone with our own capabilities in the southern part of the Gaza Strip, and then told the Palestinians that this is where you go, whether you like it or not. This is where, the only place where there's going to be food in Gaza is here. The only place where there's going to be water in Gaza, and medicine and shelter and medical supplies is here. So if you want to live, this is where you go. You get out of the battlefield and leave us to dismantle Hamas and our enemies, and you will be relatively safe in that area. That is unfortunate that we didn't do, and that we relied on so-called humanitarian organizations to do their job of providing humanitarian assistance, which they didn't. And that is really the main cause of the delay when it comes to Rafah. The most important part, and why Rafah needs to be conquered, Hamas defeated, and then for the IDF to have access, are the tunnels. If I've asked Google to add a underground layer, a tunnel layer, they have not yet done so, but I have faith in Google and that they will find a solution to adding an underground layer. If they do, if we had one, what you would be seeing, basically dozens of tunnels, some of them very long, going hundreds of yards into, well, you're Canadians, right?
Yeah.
So I can say civilized terms like meters and kilometers. So hundreds of meters into, yeah, I don't have to convert the feet. So hundreds of meters into, and sometimes even kilometers into, from Egypt, and then under this strip here into various locations inside Rafah. The sad thing is that the tunnels are not a surprise. We've known about the tunnels for 20, 25 years. They have existed for a really long time. I was a young company commander in Givati, tasked with going into one of the houses in this area here, I don't remember exactly where it was, and to locate the tunnel. We had intel that the family was running a tunnel business, which is what it was. They dug a tunnel and were availing it for Hamas, and anybody who wanted to use the tunnel. You want to smuggle something into Gaza? Here's the tunnel, this is the price per kilo, per item, per whatever. That's how it works. That's the system in Gaza. That's entrepreneurship in Gaza. So we went in there, and we fought our way to the house because it was a Rafah fight. And we got there, and then we didn't have intel on where in the house the entrance to the tunnel was. So we started searching. Then I asked one of my young soldiers, my radio man, I said, if you were running a tunnel business in your home, where would you hide the entrance? And he said, he thought about it for a second, and he said, I'd hide it in the kids' room. So we went to the kids' room, moved the beds, and found the opening of the tunnel. And what we saw, and I remember peeking above it after we cleared it with the EOD to make sure that it wasn't rigged. We opened it up, and down about 25 meters, 30 meters down, a shaft, very well constructed, with electricity, with communications, with air, all of that provided, and that was in 2004. And since then, they have only gotten better and better. The tunnels going under Rafah are tunnels big enough for a Ford 150 to drive. So these are not small tunnels that you may have seen pictures of, those small tunnels where I wouldn't be able to stand straight and most of you wouldn't be able to stand straight. Those are basically tunnels that are designed for movement of terrorists into Israel in order to kill and abduct and then to get back. These are tunnels that are designed to haul goods. And that is what they've been doing with great efficiency since, I'd say, the late, early 2000s, to be conservative to the assessment. For Israel to defeat Hamas and to accomplish goal number one of the war, which is to dismantle Hamas's military capabilities, Israel has to take the tunnels. There's no two ways about it. If we don't dismantle the tunnels, we're just kicking the can half a year, 2 years down the road. Because open tunnels means that someone else, whether it's Hamas, Islamic Jihad, whatever new terror organization will emerge, will have the ability to resupply. We can control the air, we can control the sea. If we don't control underground and cut the tunnels, then they will resupply and we will be inviting trouble for ourselves in the future. That's really why taking Rafah and dismantling and taking that area is so important. And also, I think there's now a certain symbolic dimension to the situation in Rafah, from a Hamas perspective and also from an Israeli perspective, which makes it even more important to take. Before we do questions, there's a lot to speak about in Gaza, and you'll ask questions and I'll try to answer. I want to speak about the situation along Israel's northern border. So we traveled north, we crossed Judea and Samaria, all of the troubled hotspots like Jenin and Nablus, where the Palestinian Authority doesn't rule anymore, and local terror organizations and thugs and gangs rule. And we go towards the Lebanese border and zoom in a little bit. So Rosh Hanikra in the west, last alarm sounded in northern Israel was approximately half an hour ago. Rockets were fired towards this area. Yesterday we had rockets in Nahariya, and last night we had rockets towards Tzfat in this area. By the way, 3 weeks ago we passed another sad milestone, that for the first time in the war, more rockets were fired from the north towards Israel than from Gaza. Numbers-wise, just to put things into perspective, and all of these numbers they're astronomical, but we're talking about almost 13,000 rockets that have been fired from Gaza towards Israel. Rockets, mortars, UAVs, projectiles, whatever, but basically 13,000 things have been fired towards Israel from Gaza, and about 3,500 from Lebanon. But now, per day, there's more rockets fired from the north than there is from the south, because we have degraded Hamas capabilities to fire in the south. They still have rockets, and the moment that we'll pull out, they will surely be able to fire rockets again. But whenever something fires in Gaza, we are able to very quickly zoom in on it and take it out. In Lebanon, rockets are being fired, of course, from within civilian population, of course, using houses and proximity to schools and hospitals for their protection. So we have Rosh Hanikra in the west, we have the Hermon mountain here in the east, and the triangle of borders between Lebanon on this side, Syria on that side, and Israel, Golan Heights here in the south. 120 kilometers of border. And what we have are approximately 100,000 Israeli civilians that have been evicted or evacuated from their homes in the northern part of Israel. For 6 months, these Israelis are out of their homes. This has no precedent in Israeli history. The Egyptian army, the Syrian army, the Jordanian army, other terrorist organizations, nobody ever succeeded in evicting Israelis from their homes for such an extended period of time and from so many different locations. The war won't end before Israelis can go back to their homes. They won't be able to go back to their homes before it's safe. What defines safety? Not the lack of ability of the enemy to fire rockets. I think this is something that sadly our enemies in Gaza will have the ability to do even for a long period of time. When we define safety for Israeli civilians, I'll zoom in so that I can explain it better. Let's take one of the kibbutzim, which is in let's say Bala. So you see there's a beautiful kibbutz here. This is Bal'am. See here, Bal'am. The kibbutz that was here long before the State of Israel was founded, or a few years before. This was 49. So we can take another kibbutz which is older and it makes the point more conveniently, like Malkiah. So Malkiah, this kibbutz here, you can see that it's on the border. This kibbutz has been evacuated a long time ago. They're in direct line of sight and line of fire of the terrorists, and the specific weapon that Hezbollah is using to make life dangerous for our civilians are anti-tank missiles. The same anti-tank missiles that Russian troops are firing at Ukrainian troops and civilians in Ukraine are the same weapons that Hezbollah is using against our civilians. And the reason that what basically needs to happen is for Hezbollah to be moved to retreat at least 5.5 kilometers, preferably 10 kilometers from the border, so that they are not within striking range of Israeli communities that are close to the border. That's what needs to happen. What needs to happen is that Hezbollah will agree and say, okay, we take 5 or 10 steps back and we agree to stay back. That sounds odd to you, right? It sounds like a very un-Middle Eastern thing to do. to do what your enemy needs you to do, and I think it's less likely that they will do so unless they're really forced to. And the way of that happening is either through a diplomatic deal brought about by US, French, and German, and others that are trying to negotiate it, or by war. These are the two options. And so far, for 6 months, what Israel has been trying to facilitate is the first option of having a diplomatic deal in order to not to have to go to war. But in this catch-22 situation, we're not left with many options. And just to put things into perspective, Hezbollah is about 5 times more powerful than Hamas. More rockets, longer range, bigger warheads, better accuracy, more personnel, better equipped, better trained. All of the military metrics, when you compare Hamas to Hezbollah, are very bad, and that is probably one of the reasons why we are so cautious when it comes to taking a few steps further and still trying to get that diplomatic solution. So, wrapping up, before we start asking questions, a complex situation, very complex situation along the northern border, where I do not yet see the off-ramp from an Israeli perspective. We have not spoken about Syria and the Iranian proxies in Syria and the Syrian military, what they're up to. We haven't detailed the situation in Jordan, but there's a lot happening. And mind you, our longest border of about 400 kilometers is with Jordan. It is also, secretly I can say, with just us and the Chinese on your phones listening, it is the border where we have the least amount of troops and infrastructure. We have rather strong defenses on the Syrian border, the Golan, along the Lebanese border. We thought that we had a strong defense around Gaza. We were proven wrong, but we now have lots of troops there. And we have significant infrastructure and a peace treaty with Egypt. And we have the peace treaty with Jordan, but we do not have significant infrastructure. So if you ask me where to look for horribly interesting things, Jordan is definitely a contender for that. And we haven't spoken about the Palestinian Authority. I invite you to ask questions about it if you want. The PA, where they are, the political abilities, and as I said, we haven't spoken about Israeli politics either, which matter. They do matter in this situation. Questions, please. Yes, ma'am.
So there's a few of us from the U.S. here, and most of this group is Canadian.
So I apologize.
I'll Google
Okay.
So, but anyway, as I'm sure you're aware, there's like massive demonstrations going on daily in cities in the U.S. and Canada, and UK, parts of Europe, Australia. And I'm wondering if you have any comments or insight in talking about proxies, how funding is flowing to support those demonstrations?
So in the FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, they did a very interesting study on foreign funding in to U.S. universities. As you know, there are laws in the U.S. which prohibit direct funding by a foreign government of U.S. institutions of higher education. And in order to circumvent that, what many countries and entities do is that they have front organizations in the U.S., the Fellowship of, the Friends of, and many other things, different think tanks and different organizations, and then through those organizations they donate money. And the FDD did an assessment of which are the amount of money by country that contributes money to U.S. universities. Number one, not surprisingly, Qatar. Number two, China. Number 3, if I'm not mistaken, Russia, but I could be mistaken. But all of the countries are very bad countries. And it's no surprise, Saudi Arabia is 3, and then Russia is somewhere down the list. All of you see that there's a lot of foreign involvement. I don't have intelligence and specific data on funding for those demonstrations. We do have visibility of what happens at universities, and I think they are connected. There's a tie, there's a link between students for the justice of Palestine, or Jews for justice in Palestine, and all of the justice cohort, and other organizations who are either funded by Qatar. By the way, you'll be amazed that the Palestinian Authority also contributes money, donates money to US universities, about $1 billion per year. Yes, which I was very surprised to see. A country that, or an entity that basically lives out of schnorr and depends on others for their own budget, they have enough money to handouts, has enough money to donate to American universities. What I think is very important, in addition to this, is what is Israel doing and what is U.S. government doing about it, the Canadian government also. I think the answer is not enough on all 3 accounts. I can only speak about my government. I think that we have underestimated and under-addressed the issue of Ivy League universities in the U.S. and where they have gone. Of course, it's a deep cultural issue. These are deep cultural trends of what's considered good, benign, and ideals that should be strived for, which are all on the other side, not related to Israel. And these are deep trends in society that, of course, Israel as a country alone cannot really fight, but I think we haven't been doing enough at all, and we haven't been cognizant of the challenge that this will pose Israel in the future, when almost everybody who goes to certain faculties at Harvard gets brainwashed against Israel. And that's a problem. That's a strategic issue for Israel, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. Yes, ma'am.
Can I ask you, sir, I'm just returning from Shaar Zedek, it's near 5 kilometers from the military airport.
Yeah.
How does that factor into the equation for northern?
Oh, art instead.
Very nice.
Yeah. Mishmar Ha'emek, close to Ramat David, yes. What about it?
You made a comment about northern Israel enclosures.
Yes.
How is it safe in that area?
Mishmar Ha'emek, they're relatively safe. And if they're close to an air base, on one hand, that's more likely to be a target. On the other hand, much more likely to be well protected by the Iron Dome, because we won't let, that's strategic infrastructure. So air bases will be defended very, very effectively by the Iron Dome. Many other parts of Israel will not be. When we think about numbers, according to IDF assessments, Hezbollah has enough rockets to sustain about a fire rate of about 4,500 rockets per day for a certain period of time before we are able to minimize those numbers, basically to increase their ability to do so. But 4,500 rockets per day is an astronomical number. What that means is that there will be locations in Israel that will be defended by our air defenses, like the port in Haifa, the port in Ashdod, our electric grid and generators, the gas grid offshore, many other very important strategic targets, but we don't have enough air defenses to defend all of Israel. And Israeli civilians will have to rely on their shelters for protection. And when we look at the weapons that Hezbollah has, some of them are very big missiles with 20, 30, 40 kilo warheads, which make a lot of damage. if they hit. So we are talking about an order of magnitude of conflict much more violent and devastating than what we're dealing with now. Yes, sir. And then you.
Lisa?
Yes, sir.
I live in Netanya, central. What you've just suggested is that in due course, I am in a very unsafe area because we are not covered. You know, it's gone up. They've rocketed up to the south of Tel Aviv, and they have on the northern border, but the central section where I live, nothing as yet. But what you have just said is that there's some really heavy rockets sitting out there ready for me. Is that right?
Well, look at it on the bright side.
I live in the town.
Yes, you live in Netanya, you're close to the beach, that's great. But in all seriousness, the biggest problem is that we in Israel, the whole strategic layout of the country is that almost all of what matters from an economic and military point of view is concentrated between Haifa and Ashdod. Haifa in the north and Ashdod in the south, and then about 20, let's say 40 to 20 kilometers to the east. This little strip, this is where 80% of our GDP is generated, and 75% of the GDP and 80% of the Jewish population lives. Not very smart, because we have many other parts of a beautiful country where there's a lot of room to grow, but less Jews live there. Why do I speak about that? Because from a strategic point of view, our enemies of course know that, and they will be focusing most of their fire towards this area. But so far, as you say correctly, I don't think Netanya has even been fired at once during this war, and I hope it won't be. And in any case, it's relatively, and there's also nothing very important close to Netanya, which is good for Netanya. There's the power station in Hadera, so that will be targeted. And then Tel Aviv is Tel Aviv, it's a symbol, they will be targeted. Netanya, I think you're relatively, and of course they'll fire at there as well.
Lauren's gonna help
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm wondering if we can talk about the hostages and your thoughts on where that's going.
My thoughts are that I am extremely sad for the families. I am surprised and disappointed that after 6 months we have not yet gotten them home. I think that this wound, which hasn't even started to scar or to heal, is what we will carry onwards as a country and as a people for the longest time. This will be the most difficult thing. And I really thought in the beginning of the war, when I was mobilized to reserves and when we did some strategic planning, thinking of where this was going to go, I didn't imagine that we would be half a year after and still have Israeli hostages in this hell under earth. Sadly, I'm not optimistic. I do not think that Hamas really is inclined to release hostages. We did one deal, we got more than 100 souls back. There are 134 Israelis unaccounted for. Many of them are dead, confirmed dead. Some of them are feared dead. And I don't think that Hamas really wants to let any substantial amount of them go. What they did in the negotiations was just to run the clock, buy time. And they wanted to get close enough to Ramadan so that we wouldn't launch an offensive on Rafah before Ramadan. And now that Ramadan has come and gone, and hopefully it will go without any major incidents, at the end of Ramadan, the next order of business is Rafah. And now I think that what you'll see in the coming weeks, more talks, more reports, more buzz around it. I don't think that they are sincerely interested in releasing hostages, and I think that they are going to hold on to them until it is too late. I very much hope I'm wrong, and I wish, the IDF has tried to get hostages out. We've launched operations, raids, gone into tunnels. The best, except for those two men who were rescued out of Rafah and the young female soldier rescued out of northern Gaza ages ago, what appears like ages ago. The closest that our troops have gotten is warm blankets to get to locations where hostages were held, but they got there too late because there were so many layers of obstacles, booby traps, blast doors, and many other things on the way that made it difficult for our troops to get there in time. And soldiers have been killed, soldiers have been wounded trying to do so, and I am extremely saddened by the whole situation, and sadly, despite all the efforts, the personnel, the people who are trying to do it, I am not very optimistic. By the way, it's another important point why we need to go into Rafah, because the last location where there's a high probability of hostages being held above and underground is Rafah. So it's another justification, as if we need one after October the 7th, but another reason for us to go into Rafah. You, sir, have something? Yes.
Can you comment on the new PM of the Palestinian Authority, whether that has any significance? Is there any sort of hope that comes from that, or just more of the same?
A cynical, transparent PR stunt of a Abbas loyalist and crony. He's a numbers guy, a finance guy. He may not be, a deviant terrorist at heart, and he may not be the most extreme of Palestinians. I'm sure that there are many worse, but the Palestinian Authority has not changed and is not changing, and I don't think it will change. The Palestinian Authority is corrupt, rotten to the core, despised by Palestinians, unable to govern in the area that they were given after the Oslo Accords, which are supported, and despite the fact that they are supported by the US, supported with advisors and military assistance, propped up by Israel indirectly, despite that, they're just losing ground every day. And if elections were held today in Judea and Samaria, in the PA areas, according to Palestinian polls done by a Palestinian nationalistic pollster, Dr. Shikaki, and you can look it up. He does polls every few months. In Judea and Samaria, Hamas, I think, wins 72% or 73%. In Gaza, 67%. The question was, if elections are held today, who would you vote for? And then there's many other interesting questions about how much do you identify with what Hamas did on October the 7th? Do you believe that Hamas has done war crimes or anything that is untoward in terms of the fighting? And many other things, and all of the results are very bad, very negative. And the bottom line is the PA. Yes, it's relevant because the world keeps on insisting in making it relevant, but on the ground they do not govern. And anybody who speaks about the two-state solution, I say, great, I want peace. I want my kids to live in peace, and I want my grandchildren to live in peace with our neighbors. Them in a respectable situation, are we secure and sovereign? But I don't think that this Palestinian Authority is what is the vehicle that would bring that about. And I don't think that our peace partners are inclined. If you vote for Hamas, you are not looking for peace. Hamas means annihilation of Israel. That's their charter. Kill Jews in Israel. So to say two-state solution, that is some kind of a solution to a problem at this time, extremely tone deaf. Yes. Yeah,
So I just want to ask, because I know you spent some time in Sweden, I'm Norwegian, so I wanted to ask you a question about how things are in Scandinavia right now, and it's not good in Norway, it's very
Yes.
one-sided reported. I know that there are demonstrations outside Israel that see burning flags, and the media is not reporting it at all. Why do you think like Scandinavian people are so anti-Israeli?
so I'm traveling to Norway in May. I've been invited to speak at the pro-Israeli conference, MIFF, 10th of June. Yeah, 10th, yeah, somewhere around 10th of June, June or May. And I try to engage with Norwegian and Scandinavian media. Let's look at first the positive thing. When you look at the statements made by the government of Sweden, I expected much worse. And I expected even worse from the Norwegians, even though the Norwegians are very bad when it comes to Israel, but I expected worse. I expected even more extreme statements, and they have not come from the government. Yes, there's the so-called Refugee Council, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and they have been campaigning in Israel, against Israel from day one in Gaza, trying to undermine our legitimacy and undermine the activity of the troops. But on a government level, things could be far worse. Specifically in Sweden, the Swedish government has not been anywhere near the extreme position that they had just a few years ago. Rather have the Norwegians. I think that the problem that Norway and Sweden have, and how it's reflected by sentiment on the street, it's first and foremost a Norwegian and Swedish problem. They don't own their own countries anymore. And what's happening is that they have forfeited control over the public space, public domain, and a lot of the culture to people with a Middle Eastern mindset. And how that embodies is currently protests against Israel, because that's a hot topic. But Israel isn't the issue. It's the future of these two states. Are they going to be Scandinavian, Christian-oriented, or Christian cultured countries? Or are they going to be something that resembles the Middle East? And it is concerning. I have many, of course, friends and still family in Sweden. The Israeli embassy is on lockdown. The ambassador is threatened. I think he's one of the most threatened Israeli ambassadors abroad. I don't know how many times he goes to the embassy, because it is extremely dangerous there. And it's really a sign of weakness of these countries. And just like ma'am asked before about universities and protests, etc., yeah, I'm concerned about it because it threatens my brothers and sisters, and it reflects and it endangers Israel indirectly. But it's first and foremost a problem for that country, that they are allowing these things to deteriorate, and for hostile, undemocratic, backward Middle Eastern kind of medieval mindset people take control over public space and public discourse. I am encouraged when I look at polls and political results of elections in various countries, where I see people pushing back and saying, no, we don't like this. We do not like, this isn't what we and our ancestors worked hard and diligently for to create in our society. Scandinavian countries are amongst the best in the world in almost all rankings, right? Quality of living, education, healthcare, etc., etc., etc. And that's not what they work for, and many are responding to what they're seeing on the ground. I personally hope that this will backfire. This brutal, racist, hateful activities by Islamists in Scandinavia will backfire, and that people will push back. It won't be pretty, but I always remind people when they talk about Europe, and I say this, as gently as I can, the worst atrocities in the world, they were done by white men. When they need to be brutal, they know how to be brutal. So I don't think that it's, I think that they're playing a dangerous game. Many of the people who are out and displaying that kind of violence and hatred. And hopefully this will generate change. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the challenge with the aid trucks?
So it's not only the trucks, it's a bigger problem. The whole issue of providing humanitarian aid in Gaza is it's shaping up to be the most decisive factor or influential factor on Israel's ability to achieve its goals. Right? What Israel wants to do is to make sure that October 7 won't happen again, and that there won't be a significant military threat emanating from Gaza for the coming generation. What we set out to do, what the cabinet decided, dismantle Hamas's military capabilities and their administrative capabilities. That's the plan so far. We don't yet know, it hasn't been said officially and voted on by the cabinet what the plan is for once that is achieved, and how the achievement of these two goals, to dismantle Hamas militarily and politically, what they are supposed to serve, and how Israel is planning for the day after. I sure hope that the government will avail itself and find time to think that out and come up with a strategy. I think it's a very good time to do that. But the provision of aid and the whole humanitarian situation is proving, I think, to be the most influential factor. What's going on in Gaza now is that there are, I'll show you the various efforts where humanitarian aid is how it's being delivered. Number one, the first one to open, and that has been continuously active, has been via trucks through Rafah, in this area here, from Egypt. That was the first opening that was open, where trucks that were inspected by Israeli security at Nitzana. I'll zoom out here to see it. So you see the border crossing here at Nitzana. Here, there's a border crossing here. So trucks came from Egypt at El Arish and other places, offloaded or loaded, then went to Nitzana, was cleared for security, and then went up Rafah, and then into the Gaza Strip, and then distributed aid into the Gaza Strip by the same trucks. That was the first venue. Second venue, despite the fact that Israeli hostages were kept in Gaza and they didn't get any humanitarian assistance, not medicine, not medical care, nothing, Israel decided to open the Kerem Shalom goods crossing here in the south. You can see it here, Kerem Shalom. And this terminal is now active, and there are dozens of trucks coming in here every day from Israel, basically trucks that are loaded with goods in Ashdod, the Israeli port of Ashdod. I don't know what's up with the computer today. The Israeli port of Ashdod, loaded here with goods, travel down south, go into Kerem Shalom, and then provide aid to the south, but also in the trucking up to northern Gaza. And you can see from a geographical point of view that doesn't make a lot of sense to go from the north to the south and then go up the north again. So what Israel did was to pave a new road, a new asphalt road, a new crossing from the northern part of the Gaza Strip, approximately in this area, to access Gaza from here. And again, goods from Israel, checked and cleared in terms of security, that are then delivered to northern Gaza. So that's 3 ground crossings. A fourth venue is via sea, and it's already operational. Goods are delivered from via sea to the port of Gaza, and what the American military is building in coordination with Israel is a temporary pier, not a port, but a pier. It's basically lots of metal rafts that are connected and then anchored, which will allow bigger ships to anchor closer to the shore and then offload their goods and then the goods to be delivered to Gaza. The problem with Gaza is that they don't have a deep sea port and big ships can't approach it. So that's why there's a need to build that kind of a pier. That's happening already and it will increase. And the fourth venue is via air. The US, Jordan, Egypt, UAE, France, and a few other countries have airdropped food and other thousands of tons of humanitarian supplies from the air, most of them accurate, most of them to where they were supposed to go, but sadly, much of that aid is according to jungle laws, survival of the fittest or the strongest, or basically the Hamas guy with an AK-47. Who go there, see, take what they want, and then sell it on the market, even though it's labeled humanitarian aid not for sale. They sell it on the markets at exorbitant prices, by the way. According to the information that the IDF has, there is no famine and no hunger in Gaza. Is that discomfort? Definitely. Do people live in horrible conditions? Clearly. Would it be better if there was no war? Also clearly. But none of that is relevant. But there is a lot of aid coming in. There's about between 250 and 280 trucks coming in every day with humanitarian goods, food, clothing, water, and medical supply, which should be enough. Now, those who are, nitpickers, I've had that question, and they've said, well, before the war, about 1,000 trucks used to come into Gaza every day. So now you say that there's only 250, of course there's a famine. Then I say, no, look at the numbers a bit closely and do your work. 1,000 trucks was agricultural produce and fertilizers, construction equipment, which is a big bulk, clothing, consumer goods, and many, many other things that were brought into Gaza before October 7th through the Israeli crossings. That's why it was 1,000 trucks per day. 200, more than 200, almost 300 trucks of food is more than enough. The problem is of the final leg of distribution. Just like when you're waiting for an Amazon package and you see that it was delivered to the courier facility and okay, when is the courier leaving? And when does he finally go to the round and deliver the package? Exactly the same thing here. The problem is the last stage, it's not bringing it into Gaza, it is who gets it in Gaza and who makes sure that the aid goes to those who really need it and who are the intended recipients of it. That's where the problem is. Problems are a result of Hamas, that they steal the humanitarian aid, and of a corrupt UNRWA that is in cahoots with Hamas. Last question, yes?
You spoke about the role that Iran plays in the region, and you and the FDD may have the strongest, loudest voice on that issue. There seems to be a consensus around it, but you said until we deal with it. Who's the we in that sentence?
I only speak about Israel.
So Israel has the capability and the stomach to deal with it, or is it wishful thinking that they will do it?
Capability, definitely. Israel has done more complex and challenging military operations than what I'm talking about. Of course, it means a lot, right? It's not a small decision to take on terrestrial targets in Iran. Not a small thing at all. But I think that it's necessary, it's doable, and I think that we would be wrong not to do it, because again, it depends on how we want to live here. I don't want to live in an Israel that is surrounded by Iranian proxies who have the ability to choose when, where, and how strong they want to attack Israel. And for certain, if Iran is challenged in terms of its ability to generate money, they will face a dilemma on what do we do with the little money that we have. If they're not challenged, then why should they change? And if they don't change, our reality continues to be bad. And I think we deserve better. Of course, going to war or making striking an enemy and possibly escalating the situation is a heavy decision. But when I look at, okay, for the last 20 years, the Iranians have been building proxies. Now we have proxies all around us, and the noose is tightening. We did one strategy, which basically said, let's not escalate the situation, let's not do preemptive strikes, let's not take military action against Iran, not against their nuclear program, and not against their regional terrorist program. That got us to where we are now, with 130,000 rockets in Hezbollah storage, 30,000 rockets used to belong to Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, Palestinian terrorists armed to their teeth with weapons, Iranian proxies in Syria with missiles, rockets, drones, and other heavy weapons capable of striking Israel, Houthis in Yemen, which are far away, 2,000 kilometers, but also a threat, a lesser threat, but also a threat. And all of that is happening, and I think we have a say. We should have a say in what happens around our country and how our civilians are threatened. And after October the 7th, I think we have to. And I think it would be very wrong if we don't reevaluate our strategy and say, okay, this was a strategy so far, it had advantages and disadvantages. Advantages were more extended time between fighting, so good for the economy, good for other developments, and other things. But on the other hand, it's like, it's like mortgaging your future. That's what we've done. And if we don't want to do that, and I don't think that we should, then let's revisit and think about our strategy. Maybe the idea to strike Iranian ports isn't the best way of getting it done. For me, it doesn't matter. I think that we have to take Iran and place a dilemma for Iran. If you want to continue to fund proxy organizations and fight indirectly with us, we're not going to play along your line, your rules. We're going to change those. And if you want to continue, here's the price. And then they will think, then we'll see how strong they are, how brave they are. And I don't think that they are that brave, strong, or committed to actually fighting. Thank you for your attention.